Is called to order, and we will start with an opening statement from Congressman Cummings.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am deeply honored to join Senator Warren for this, the seventh forum we have convened as part of the Middle Class Prosperity Project we launched back in February. Over the course of the past year, we've been able to shine a light on some of the most significant challenges facing our nation's middle class and those who aspire to it. I'm so proud of the work we have done, and I look forward to expanding our efforts in 2016. Today, we convene to examine what it's like to live in poverty in the richest nation on earth. Toward the middle of the last century, my parents left South Carolina and came to Baltimore to raise their family of 7 children. They came with only a third-grade education each. And my father was working on a farm where he was making literally 15 cents a day. And my mother was not making much more, 6 days a week. And they came to Baltimore again to make a difference. My father, when he got to Baltimore, started working for a company called Davidson Chemical. And when he started working for Davidson Chemical, he got a major raise to $1 an hour. That's a big raise. And so now when I walk the streets of Baltimore, I see a city where the kinds of jobs that enable men and women like my parents to move ahead and provide for their families, they're gone. Back in around 1968, we had a situation where 1 out of every 3 jobs in Baltimore were manufacturing. A person could survive with a third-grade education or a third-grade reading level. Today, it's 1 out of 15. Back then, we had Bethlehem Steel as our major manufacturer and our job creator. Today, it's Johns Hopkins Hospital and University. The loss of these jobs have left a city where approximately 1/3 of all children live in poverty, and where in some neighborhoods, half or more of all the residents have incomes below the poverty level. Earlier this year, our nation's eyes turned to Baltimore when a young man from my neighborhood who grew up there and who lived there and who his family was there, was killed while in police custody, and his name was Freddie Gray. As I said at his funeral, our nation saw Mr. Gray only after he was dead. 40 cameras from all over the world came to his funeral, but nobody seemed to see him when he lived. They did not see the profound and systemic economic disparities he's faced in his lifetime, including not only poverty, but all the challenges that often accompany it, like underperforming schools, exposure to lead paint common in an old and dilapidated housing stock, and high rates of crime and incarceration among local residents. And our nation doesn't appear to see the millions of American children who have faced the same kind of despair and privation Freddie Gray faced. These children are likely to confront potentially insurmountable hurdles their entire lives just because they grew up in poor communities. Attempting to quantify these hurdles, Dr. Raj Chetty and his colleagues have calculated that every year spent growing up in the city of Baltimore, quote, reduces a child's earning by 0.86% per year of exposure, end of quote. According to the Census Bureau in 2014, nearly 47 million Americans lived in poverty, including just over 21% of children under the age of 18. I've often said that our children are the living messages we send to a future we will never see. The question is, how will we send them? Will we send them crippled? Will we send them uneducated? Will we send them unhealthy? The Census Bureau also found that more than half of the children under the age of 6 living with a female householder to whom they were related were in poverty in 2014. How do we send them into the future? Perhaps even more shocking is the level of extreme poverty in this nation. The Census Bureau found that in 2014, approximately 45% of all the people living in poverty reported family income that was below 1/2 of their poverty threshold, including 6.8 million children. In other words, nearly half of those living in poverty in the United States are living in what can only be described as deprivation. There is no question that we should make permanent the expanded earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. In 2013, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the EITC raised 6.2 million people out of poverty, including 3.2 million children. As we speak, Republicans in Congress are considering spending billions of dollars on dozens of tax breaks for businesses, including one giveaway to Wall Street that costs $13.4 billion alone. If big business gets tax breaks, low-income Americans deserve a break too. And so, in fact, making the expand EITC and the CTC permanent is the very minimum we should be doing. Finally, let me close by saying this. As my family's experience demonstrates, we have the ability to create jobs that enable a man or a woman working full-time to lift his or her family out of poverty. We used to do this all the time, and we used to ensure that workers benefited when their productivity increased and their labor grew their employers' profits. Across the United States, tens of millions of Americans, including millions of children, living in poverty dream of a society where opportunity for all includes them too. They dream of a future where they can go to college, buy a house, raise their own families, and fulfill the potential they feel in themselves. And so it is that we owe it to these families to make sure that the American dream is still within reach for all Americans. And I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. I am glad to join Congressman Cummings today for today's Middle Class Prosperity Project Forum on Child Poverty. And we have a terrific panel here to discuss this with us. Today, more than half of all children in public school live below the poverty line. More than 16 million children live in poor families. 3 million of these children live in families surviving on less than $2 a day. You heard that right. In one of the richest nations in America, 3 million children are living in families trying to survive on $2 a day. The luck of the draw can be brutal for American children who are born to poor parents. They are more likely to have low birth weights, more cognitive delays, more behavioral problems, and worse performance in school. These early disadvantages never go away, even as the kids grow up. They are less likely to graduate from high school, more likely to be poor themselves as adults, and more likely to be unemployed. America is supposed to be the land of opportunity, a place where anyone can get ahead so long as they work hard and play by the rules. But the numbers tell a very different story. Research shows that more and more where you are born plays a powerful role in whether or not you will succeed. This is a grim story, but it comes with good news. It has been a hard and painful path, but we are learning how to cut child poverty. According to new research from the Columbia University Population Research Center, over the past 4 decades, safety net programs such as food stamps, cash assistance, unemployment insurance, housing and energy assistance, and others have reduced the child poverty rate by about 40%. The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit alone keep more than 5 million children out of poverty, and they lessen the impact of poverty for another 8 million children. In 2009, we expanded these programs on a temporary basis, raising more than 1 million additional children out of poverty. Together, these 2 tax credits are doing more to reduce child poverty than any other federal program, and they do it by helping parents work, which gives children an up-close and personal example of how to make it in America. We know how to reduce child poverty. First, make the 2009 Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit expansions permanent. These are programs that have proven their worth, and they deserve to be part of our long-term strategy to help more parents make it in the workforce and build real economic security for their families. And second, index the child tax credit for inflation. The cost of living has gone up, but the numbers haven't changed since 2001. So the value of that credit has eroded by an average of $340. Indexing will ensure that the CTC continues to work for families in the future and gives low-wage parents the same purchasing power that others get. Unfortunately, Republicans in Congress aren't really interested in making the 2009 expansions of the CTC and the EITC permanent. Instead, Republicans are focused on something else: hundreds of billions of dollars in permanent tax giveaways for corporations. Before Congress goes home for the holidays, we're likely to vote to approve those corporate giveaways. We do it nearly every year, hand over billions of dollars in tax breaks for big businesses that don't need them. Meanwhile, if Congress doesn't act on these 2 programs, the progress we've made since the 2009 expansions will eventually disappear. 1 million children will be pushed back into poverty, and another 6.7 million who are already poor will plunge even deeper into poverty. More than 13 million families with nearly 25 million children will lose an average of $1,073 each year. For families struggling to make ends meet when every dollar counts, that is a lot of money. I don't kid myself. It will take a lot more than tax credits to eliminate child poverty in America. We need to raise the minimum wage so no one who works full-time still lives in poverty. We need universal child care. We need schedules that work for a family so that mom can know if her hours are canceled before she has to arrange for child care and drive halfway across town for work. There are lots of moving parts to ending child poverty for good. But we have 2 programs right in front of us that we know work, and we need to protect those programs. It is shameful that in 2015, in the richest country on earth, millions of kids are growing up in abject poverty. The lessons have been painful, but we know how to give these children a better start in life. In an ugly and cynical Washington, we actually have a chance to do something good to make a real difference in the lives of millions of children. And that is exactly what we should do. So that's what we're here today to talk about. And I want to introduce the first of our panelists and then hand this back to the Congressman. I am delighted to be able to introduce Sister Simone Campbell. She is a member of the Sisters of Social Service and previously served as the general director of that community. She is currently the executive director of Network, a national Catholic social justice lobby. Sister Simone received her law degree from the University of California, Davis, and worked for 18 years as the lead attorney in the Community Law Center in Oakland, California. More recently, she organized Nuns on the Bus, journeys across the country, and published the memoir, A Nun on the Bus, How All of Us Can Create Hope, Change, and Community. She is a good friend and a good person who fights for those whose voices are rarely heard here in Washington. Welcome.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Catherine Eden, who is the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in the Department of Sociology at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in my district. She holds a PhD from Northwestern University and is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Together with H. Luke Schaefer, she most recently published the book $2 a Day, Living on Almost Nothing in America, which was just named one of the 100 notable books of 2015. Congratulations, by the New York Times. And so we welcome you.
Yes. And our third panelist here today is Mr. Robert Greenstein, who is the founder and president of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Now, before founding this center, Mr. Greenstein served as the administrator of the Food and Nutrition Service at the U.S. Department of Agriculture under President Carter. In 1996, he received a MacArthur Fellowship, and in 2010, he was awarded the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize from the American Academy of Political and Social Science. This is an amazing group.
Yes, I agree.
Congressman?
We can start with Sister Simone.
Good.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here and to have a chance to explore this critical issue. And I so agree with your statement, Congressman and Senator, as being really the heart of the issue. Our children are suffering and our nation is failing the future. That is the challenge. I'd like to share with you some of the experiences that we had this past 2 months ago when we organized a 2-week bus trip in advance of Pope Francis's visit to the United States. We wanted to take his message of an economy of inclusion out to our people and to hear their stories and bring them back. On this trip, as on previous trips, we came to know in our hearts that families in our nation are struggling and children often pay the price of that struggle. These are a few of their stories. I met Anika in Nashville, Tennessee. At the age of 5, Anika was molested and raped. She was placed in foster care but ran away and was homeless by the age 15. By the time she was out of her teens, she had children, had begun doing drugs. She lost her kids to a foster system that had failed her and was incarcerated over 80 times, all out of a childhood of tragedy. Anika is an ex-felon now, but thanks to the Magdalene House in Nashville, she's found another way. She's completed their 2-year program and is now working full-time in their business, Thistle Farms, which specializes in online sale of beauty products that they make at the farm. In the process of recovery, she's reunited with her children and is building a home with them. What she told us was that the financial assistance of the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit on her very first tax return was enough for her to save and to make the down payment for a home. She is the first homeowner in her family, and she is reunited with her children in that home after 5 years after leaving prison but getting in this amazing program. It is true that a little bit of help makes a huge difference. Just before our bus trip, I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and I visited the Salvation Army homeless shelter. There I met families who were employed but still homeless. They told me that they weren't making enough money to afford housing in the tight Madison market. Additionally, many of them could not work the longer hours offered to them because the only available bus that they had to get back to their children at the shelter from their suburban jobs left at 8 p.m. so that they couldn't work until 9:30 as their employer had asked. Wages, housing, transportation policies go together all to conspire to create the challenges of poverty. Those of us that have access to easy transportation often fail to know the critical intersection of work, transportation, and housing. It is a crisis. Back on the bus in Memphis at a town hall meeting, a 7-year-old came along with her dad, And she told us that we were brainstorming the divides in our society and in that area, and she raised her hand, and of course I had to give her the microphone, and she said that she saw in her community that parents had to work too many hours and couldn't spend enough time with their children. When I asked her how she knew this, she said that her mom had to work nights and she hardly ever saw her. Pope Francis says that parents need to earn enough to be able to support their families and to have leisure time with them. Speaker Ryan recently made headlines when he told his congressional colleagues that he needed time with his family guaranteed for him to take the job of Speaker. I laud Speaker Ryan for doing this. Children flourish when parents have the capacity to both support them and to spend time with them. All of our families need this simple opportunity. But the challenge of poverty is such that low-wage working parents barely have that opportunity. It is not a luxury, it's a necessity for our future. In Evansville, I met Chloe, a college freshman, who shyly told me that the cost of higher education was almost too much for her family. She told me that some of her high school classmates did not go on to college because they responsibly did not want to add to the debt of their families. What does it say about the future of our nation when our children and young people can't pursue a higher education because of costs? We're hurting our nation by stifling the creativity of our young. We are not caring for our posterity, that is the call, as we are called to do in the Constitution, and we are undermining their hope. Chloe said it was really hard for her to look to the future with her young friends because of this limited opportunity. Probably most heartbreaking for me was in Kansas City when I met 15-year-old Catherine, the oldest of 6 siblings. Her parents had been working menial jobs and supporting their family, but they were deported last March when they went to pay a traffic ticket. Now Catherine and her younger siblings, 4 of whom are U.S. citizens, live with their elderly grandmother. This is overwhelming for this elderly woman and catastrophic for this family. Catherine appeared to me to be the principal caretaker of her siblings as she held her toddler brother and kept an eye on a rambunctious group of siblings, calling them back from the curb and making sure they were safe, keeping their eye on them. But most heartbreaking for me was when I heard from her that her 12-year-old sister had attempted suicide in May because she thought that one less child would help make things better for their family. Our broken immigration system is tearing our families apart, destroying our children, exacerbating the challenges of poverty, and while we exploit the undocumented workers in our society. We like to turn a blind eye and say that they broke the law, but the fact is our economy demands their participation, and we refuse to be responsible as a nation. Therefore, Catherine and her sister Stephanie are paying the price of our refusal to act. Another important program that actually we did not see much evidence of on the bus at all is temporary assistance for needy families, and you referenced it, Senator Warren, as being the cash assistance program. The recent recession demonstrates how programs like this are needed to protect the unemployed and underemployed. But in the recent recession, this was a failed program because this program did not expand to serve those families struggling after unemployment insurance payments ran out. TANF failed our people and needs to change for the benefit of the common good. There are times when people just need a little cash in their pocket to survive. And we in this wealthy nation turn our backs on these hardworking people. We as a nation are better than this. We are better if our communities are stronger, and we must pay a just price to do the work that needs to be done to heal our society and to create hope for Chloe and for all for our future. The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, as Anika shows, need to be made permanent and expanded. We need living wages so that our people have enough to get by and can spend time with their children. Housing policy and public transportation need to be strengthened to serve working families. And education must be made affordable so that all have access to quality education and to the opportunity for the future. Oops, got lost here. 7. Sorry. It is this challenge, oh, wait a minute, it's this challenge to follow my numbering. There we go. It is also our responsibility to heal our broken immigration system. We need Congress to strengthen the programs that are designed to help hardworking families and individuals. This transformation of our economy to prioritize the common good and support our people is the economy that Pope Francis spoke about when he was here in Congress in September. He invoked the memory of Abraham Lincoln and the quest for a new birth of freedom and challenged all of us to see the open wounds of our society by confronting every form of polarization and division. Pope Francis called for an economy of inclusion where all participate in our economy and benefit from that economy, and that not all of the benefits should just go to those at the top. Well, this is the vision of the leader of my faith tradition, and I'm sort of partial to it. It is also the best of our Constitution. If we respond to the wounds of our time, then we will indeed be we the people working together to form this more perfect union. Establish justice for these hardworking families, and ensure domestic tranquility. This is our call. This is our challenge. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sister Simone. Dr. Eden.
So $2 a day is a book of stories, but its spine is a set of, I think, really striking numbers, some of which Senator Warren has shared. I want to review them for you, it's just so we can sit with them a little bit, and I hope the stories, I'll be able to introduce the 8 characters in $2 a day to you during the Q&A. So as of 2010, the best government survey available for estimating its prevalence, the Survey of Income and Program Participation, or the SIP, showed that any given month in America, roughly 1.5 million families and 3 million children were living under $2 per person per day. Now that's a cash income so low that we didn't even think it existed in America, and that number is up about 130% from just 15 years earlier when welfare reform was passed in this country. In the most recent year for which we have complete data from the SIP, 2012, we see no signs of this number of $2 a day poor depleting, despite the fact of signs that our economy is strengthening. Now, with the SIP, we could also follow children over the course of a year to see how chronic the condition of $2 a day poverty was. So we found that the number of kids living in this condition for at least 3 months, we actually were very conservative and threw out anybody who had less than a 3-month spell, had grown from about 1.7 million in 1996 to about 2.5 million in 2005 to in 2012 over 3.2, almost 3.3 million. And most of the growth has been among children who are living in spells of extreme poverty of at least 7 months in a calendar year. So as of 2012, the number of kids living in chronic extreme poverty at least 7 months in a calendar year was 1.3 million, up from about 400,000 just 15 years earlier. We've looked many other places for evidence that things at the very bottom have worsened. My longer testimony will be on the website, and you can see table after table that shows signs that since the reform of welfare and the erosion of the safety net that went along with it, we see sign upon sign that things for people at the very bottom of our income distribution have gotten worse. So you might be asking, why did this happen? 3 reasons we feature in the book. First, as Sister Simone indicated, and as a chapter of our book is entitled, Welfare is Largely Dead in America. So we reformed aid to families with dependent children in 1996. We replaced it with a program called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. And since then, the declines of this program have been truly startling. A program that used to touch the lives of about 4.6 million adults and their 9.6 million minor children in 1996 was touching only 1.1 million adults and their 2.9 million dependent children by 2012. Currently, there are more avid postage stamp collectors in the United States than there are welfare recipients. Half of the adults on TANF today come from just 2 states, California and New York, so in many other states, there is virtually no welfare system, especially in our southern and mountain states. It barely exists at all, and Indiana, I might add. Second, the bad jobs of yesterday are much, much better than the bad jobs of today. It's very important to emphasize something that was really striking in the accounts of the folks we met across the country. That is that they firmly hold the notion in their heads that they are workers and they're not dependents. They want to work, and they're trying to hold desperately to sort of the ragged edge of work. But 4 things are really impeding their ability to hang on to the labor market. First, involuntary part-time employment, which has grown. Second, unpredictable hours and practices such as emergency on-call 0-hour contracts and other devices that employers use to precisely match labor supply with customer demand. Low hourly pay plus rampant wage theft and labor law violations have all wreaked havoc on the workers holding the least skilled jobs. When we look in the SIP, what we see is 70% of the children who found themselves among the $2 a day poor actually had a parent in the labor market in the prior year. And only 10% had a parent who even claimed a dime from TANF. So what we see is that work is common, yet welfare is very, very rare. The third factor is, of course, affordable housing. Housing instability is ubiquitous both among the families in the book, $2 a day, and in the numbers from the SIP. What researchers call adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, we know now threaten the well-being of American children, not just in the near term, but follow them like a long shadow into adulthood and beyond. And in our data, it is the housing instability that so often accompanies a spell of $2 a day poverty that most often exposes children to these ACEs, including sexual abuse, as they move through multiple precarious double-ups, live in their cars, spend precious resources to secure a few nights in a cheap motel or live in shelters. So what should we do about it? We advocate 3 principles in $2 a day. First, give everyone the opportunity to work. The $2 a day poor are first and foremost workers. They take great pride in the identity of work, but we've got to come to terms with the fact that at the bottom there is too little work, much less full-time, decent, stable work to go around. After welfare reform passed in 1906, the nation did see a large increase in the number of poor parents who went to work. So one could argue that the poor have lived up to their responsibility. Remember, the name of the Welfare Reform Bill was the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. The poor have taken personal responsibility, but the nation has not done its part to secure work opportunity. Second, all parents deserve the opportunity to raise children in a home of their own. Increasing the risk of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, is simply too high of a cost to pay from a public health perspective and also from a moral perspective. It is vital that the nation expand its stock of affordable housing, perhaps especially in high-growth markets where rents are steepest but jobs are also strongest. And third, we have to come to terms with the fact that sometimes, for some people, work just doesn't work. We do need a safety net that actually catches families when they fall. The block grant structure of our current welfare programs offers perverse incentives to states to deflect welfare dollars to other uses, and they do so. But the ultimate litmus test we endorse for any reform is whether it will serve to integrate the poor into society. We believe that it is not enough to provide material relief to those experiencing extreme deprivation. We need to craft solutions that knit these hard-pressed citizens back into the future of their communities and to their nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eden. And now, if we could have Mr. Greenstein.
Thank you very much. It really is an honor to be on a panel with Sister Simone and Catherine Eden. You know, for me, $2 a day is not one of the 100 most important books of the year. For me, it is the most important book I've read all year, and I would urge anyone and everyone interested in poverty to please read the book. Congressman Cummings, Senator Warren, you both cited, before I go to that, let me make one more point about the book. So the people Kathy talks about in the book, who are at the very bottom, I'm going to talk for the next few minutes primarily about the Earned Income Credit and the Child Credit, critically important. They are extremely important for working poor families. The people in Kathy's book, most of them don't currently have earnings. For them, these credits aren't nearly enough. They don't have enough earnings to qualify for much in the way of the credits. Other interventions and programs are more important, and from a safety net standpoint, by far, the most important is SNAP, what we used to call the food stamp program. It's on my mind because as we sit here now, 3 hours ago, the new Speaker of the House, Mr. Ryan, gave a speech of his vision for the future of the country, and in the speech are a couple of paragraphs in which he essentially indicates that his vision involves ending SNAP, combining it with the funding from a number of other programs, and just throwing it out as a big block grant, putting the money on the stump for governors and state legislatures. In my view, that would take the conditions in Kathy's book and make them dramatically worse in many states. But let me go back to the Earned Income Credit and the Child Credit. You both talked about the poverty-reducing effects. Senator Warren, you cited the figures for the EITC. Let me just give a few figures for the Earned Income Credit and the low-income component of the child tax credit combined. And when you combine them, in 2013, they lifted 9.5 million people out of poverty, including 5 million children, and in addition to that, they made 22 million other people less poor. They didn't get them over the poverty line, but they got them closer to the poverty line. Now, when you look at the number of people lifted out of poverty by the credits, it's more than any other program except Social Security, and for children, it's more than any other program, as you noted, including Social Security, and yet the figures I just cited probably understate it for the following reason. There is extensive academic research. There is agreement among academics across the political spectrum, from the most conservative to the most progressive, that the Earned Income Credit has a powerful effect in pulling people into the labor force, particularly single parents. All the numbers Senator Warren cited, I cited, of the number of people lifted out of poverty, these are the number lifted out if you compare people's incomes without the credits to people's incomes with the credits. But what that doesn't capture are the added earnings that people have because they went to work as a result of the credits. So there's a major new study by one of the top academic researchers on these issues, Hillary Hoynes, out a few months ago, and it finds that when you factor in that as well, the number of single-parent families lifted out of poverty by the EITC almost doubles. So it's very, very dramatic. Now, that fact is an indication that the EITC, the child credit, they aren't just safety nets that make you somewhat less poor or no longer poor. And in fact, they do more even than just pulling people into the labor force. We really ought to think of them as programs that are simultaneously effective safety nets and effective ladders. So to me, one of the most important developments in academic poverty research of the last 5 years is, given better data and the ability to follow children in longitudinal records over decades, researchers have now looked at what happens to children who get the credits versus comparable children who don't. Children who got SNAP when they were young compared to comparable children who don't. And what they find is that the EITC is linked to improvements in infant health indicators such as higher birth weight, less premature birth, tied to improvements in maternal health, really striking findings of improvements in test scores and educational attainment in school. Now, we're not sure exactly why, but the leading thinking is that there's also an emerging body of critically important research if one is concerned about child poverty, about toxic stress. Some of it being done in your state by Jack Shonkoff and others at Harvard. And it finds that a number of factors, including severe economic deprivation, greatly increase the incidence of toxic stress in families with young children, and the toxic stress physiologically impedes brain development and limits children's potential in school and later in the workforce. And as a result, that programs like the Earned Income and Child Credit, and I think some other evidence suggests likely things like SNAP as well, reduce the toxic stress, and we know for a fact that they are linked to significant improvements in school performance, which then in turn is linked to improvements in college enrollment and increased earnings and employment in adulthood. And to complete the life cycle, if you have increased earnings and employment in adulthood, you also qualify for more Social Security when you retire in old age. So the benefits of the credits are really massive. Now, this brings us to the current moment, where we're having these negotiations over the year-end tax legislation. I want to underscore what you and Senator Warren have said, how critically important it is to, Senator Warren, I was just about to underscore your message and Congressman Cummings' message about how critically important it is in the tax negotiations to make permanent the improvements in the Earned Income Credit and the Child Credit that were enacted in 2009 and are due to expire at the end of 2017 if not extended. Those improvements alone lift 16 million people, including 8 million children, either out of poverty or closer to the poverty line every year. And to give you just one example of what will happen if they die at the end of 2017, if you take a mother who has 2 kids and works full-time year-round at the minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which, given the composition of Congress, is not going to rise at the federal level for the foreseeable future. So she works full-time year-round. She makes $14,500 a year on which to support herself and her 2 kids. She gets a child tax credit of about $1,700. But if these improvements expire, it goes from $1,700 down to zero. So the impact here, the need to make these permanent is really important, and I worry, given who knows what happens in the election and where we are in 2017, I'm very nervous about letting this go. Senator Warren also mentioned, and I agree, the importance of indexing the child tax credit. A $1,000 credit, the $1,000 is eroding to inflation. I would say that when one looks at the anti-poverty impacts, there are significant impacts from indexing the child credit. They actually pale, though, to the huge, much bigger impacts from making permanent the improvements set to expire in 2017. My only point is we should do all of them. But if we can't get the indexing, unfortunately, but we can get the others, we should grab them. We shouldn't let them go if we can't get all 3. That's sort of my little editorial message. Finally, although this isn't explicitly children, it really connects. The big hole in the refundable tax credits are for workers who are not raising minor children in the home. This includes a lot of young people starting out. This includes a lot of non-custodial fathers who are expected to support their kids. Not only is the earned income credit for them really tiny, it is so small that, combined with other features of the tax code, single workers are the only group of Americans left whom we literally tax into or deeper into poverty. The Tax Reform Act of '86 took all other workers, prevented the federal tax system from taxing other workers into poverty, but it didn't get the job done for single workers. And we did better in the years since then when we expanded the earned income credit and put in the low-income component of the child credit. But, you know, for workers working at low wages who aren't raising children, they still bear significant tax burdens. And they don't get the support and the work incentive that the EITC provides to others. And we do have, here's an area where President Obama and Paul Ryan have virtually identical proposals, including, for the first time, extending the EITC for childless workers, as we call them, to younger people. Right now, if you're under age 25, you're ineligible, which is another problem. So all of these things, I think, are elements on the poverty agenda, starting, hopefully, in the next couple of weeks with making permanent the critical improvements in the earned income and child tax credits that were first enacted in 2009.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. And I apologize for popping in and out. We have, we have a reconciliation bill on the floor, and I'm going to be in there voting on every one of these amendments that come up. So, and thank you for your willingness to move over here so we could do it from here, and it's just a short run, even though it's a little noisy here. People are out doing business, I think, in the hall. So, terrific, terrific testimony, and I'm very, very grateful for it. Let me start someplace on this. I want to pick up right where you were, Mr. Greenstein. The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit have proven records of encouraging work, of lifting children out of poverty. But Republicans claim that we shouldn't expand those programs because there's too much fraud in them. So I want to go straight at this as our opening point here. Look, like most people, I strongly oppose fraud. Tax refunds should go only to people who qualify for them. But if there are problems, I want to make sure that we're tackling the root causes and we don't just chase a bunch of rumors. So, Mr. Greenstein, my question is, the GAO and the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration have done an analysis showing that as much as a quarter of the EITC and refundable CTC payments may be made improperly. What exactly is an improper payment in the context of these programs?
So the latest Treasury IRS estimate of the overpayment rate is 22 for the EITC is 22 to 26%. On its face, that would seem to suggest that 22 to 26% of the dollars paid out are paid out in error. However, a number of things have to be said about that. Item number one, many experts, ourselves, and in particular, Nina Olson, who's the IRS taxpayer advocate, believe that those figures overstate the true error rate because many filers, when they get audited, are selected for the audit type examination that underlies this study. Many low-income filers asked to look at the complex questions of, did the child live with you more than 6 months? I should note that the bulk of the errors relate to confusion and errors on who can properly claim the child in divorced, separated, and three-generation families. The credit is very complicated rules for those families. In fact, the number of pages of IRS instructions for the EITC is greater than the number of pages of IRS instructions for the alternative minimum tax.
No.
Yes.
I will use that.
So the point is that those filers who were subject to this type of examination, who come to the IRS's taxpayer advocate service, which Nina Olson runs, for assistance, when they get assistance, in 40% of the cases where the ruling was that the EITC was paid improperly, the improper ruling is overturned. The families need help in figuring out what are the documents they're supposed to provide. How do they support the claim? Secondly, as I noted, the single largest cause of errors is the wrong person claims the child. So let's say the non-custodial dad, under a child support agreement, properly claims the child for the child exemption and assumes he can also claim the child for the EITC and does. So the EITC he gets is in error. But the custodial parent, let's say the mother who's living with the child, she may have been eligible, looked like a smaller EITC, she didn't take it. The loss to the Treasury is the amount the father got in error minus the amount the mother should have gotten but didn't. That's not the way they compute the error rate, because the study doesn't have the resources to try to figure out what would the mother have gotten if she qualified. All of these are problems. Now, this is an error rate, not a fraud rate. No one has good figures on what share of this is fraud. Most analysts think the majority is confusion and inadvertent error, not fraud. But finally, part of my frustration is that some people who talk a great deal about the errors as a reason, as you said, not to extend or do more here, themselves block here in Congress some of the most effective things we could do to reduce the errors.
So let me ask you about that. So we've established that the error rate is not a fraud rate,
Correct.
right? That's the first part of what we've got here. So let me ask you the question. What would be the most effective steps for reducing the error rate in the Earned Income Tax Credit and CTC?
Now, let me put one thing to the side. In a different political atmosphere, we might think about some larger redesign of the credits to simplify them. That's because of their interaction with other parts of the code. You kind of can only do that in a larger tax reform. Given the code we have, item number one, the IRS gets better every year in using all kinds of big data and refining the technical term I think is algorithms, to identify questionable EITC claims, not fraudulent claims, not necessarily claims with any error, just there's a question. And what happens when they identify the questionable claims? Well, they have to pay most of them. They can't follow up on many of them. The share they can follow up has gone down because the Congress has cut the funding for the Internal Revenue Service. It doesn't have the ability to follow up much on the questionable claims it can identify. The first thing that members who want to reduce the error rate should do is more adequately fund the IRS. I'm not optimistic about that. Item number two, the Internal Revenue Service came up with a very important program about 4 years ago to try to improve compliance by paid preparers. 60% of all EITC claims are filed by paid preparers. The error rate is every bit as high as under self-prepared. And among the paid preparers, the category of paid preparers who are not CPAs, lawyers, enrolled agents, associated with a national chain, people most likely to have no training. Among that group, the error rate is much higher than among people who file their own EITC. So the IRS designed a whole program, very reasonable, to require some training and some very minimum competency testing so the paid preparers know the rules. A libertarian think tank filed suit and won on the grounds, nothing constitutional, on the grounds that the statute doesn't give the IRS a statutory authority to do this kind of regulation. The IRS immediately asked Congress to grant it the statutory authority. We've had about 2 years go by since that happened, and Congress so far has failed to act. Finally, and I won't go into detail, there are a series of about 5 proposals that have been for 2 years in a row in the President's budget of various kinds of procedural changes that would help the IRS lower the error rate, and Congress hasn't acted on those either.
So that's very helpful. These are good ideas to reduce the error rate, but these programs are expiring.
Yes.
And they will be expiring soon. The Republicans cannot be allowed to starve the IRS, block simplification, block the kinds of reforms that would reduce the error rates, and then cite the high error rates as a reason, an excuse, not to expand tax credits for working families. So I think this is where the battle lines are drawn, and I very much appreciate your comments on this. Congressman?
I'm going to just pick up where you left off. In Baltimore, we have something called a cash campaign. And the cash campaign, what they do is they get professionals and train them with regard to how to fill out tax returns. And because one of our concerns was that a lot of people were eligible for the tax credits, but was not taking advantage of it, which is sad. And so we wanted to make sure that we had people who were trained, who would, and if your income level was a certain level, you got free tax preparation. But one of the main objectives was to make sure that people took advantage of the EITC. And I'll bet you that the error rate is probably almost zero with these folks. I'm just guessing. Because, again, they got the training, they were dedicated, and they gave up a lot of time to do this. But, you know, I keep going back to something you said, Mr. Greenstein. You talked about the toxic stress, and you all may want to talk about this too. You know, a lot of times I think adults don't realize how children process stuff, information. And, I mean, and so you've got children who are going through toxic stress, am I right? Hello? And then I guess you've got some adults who are going through it too. And so I guess when the income is so low and they are going through all kinds of difficulties, that puts a ceiling on what they can achieve. I mean, is that a fair statement?
Well, and Kathy probably knows more than
Kathy?
I from her work. It doesn't put a ceiling for every single person.
Right.
But, you know, I think the research indicates when people don't know where they're living, do they have to double up? Do they have to move every few weeks? Are they going to be on the street? How do they pay the bill?
How do they eat?
How do they eat? The evidence increasingly indicates there are actual physiological impacts with cortisol and other things that I think occur among both the parents and the child, and that at that particularly key stage of the first few years of life, it affects brain development.
That's right.
Dr. Eden? Dr. Eden, you said you've written that living without cash in the world's most advanced capitalist society is to be trapped in a kind of purgatory. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, in a lot of other countries around the world where they have $2 a day poverty, you know, there's a rich barter economy, which you don't have here. This is the world's most advanced capitalist society, and it turns out you actually can't survive without cash. You know, it's interesting, and in watching the 18 families we followed for several years across 4 cities and rural areas in the U.S., how much work, time, and energy went in to just eking out a little bit of cash to get socks and underwear for the kids, or to keep the lights on for a little bit longer. Jennifer Hernandez in Chicago with her children, Caitlin and Cole, and spent hours every day in the summer collecting aluminum cans, which they sold at a rate that reimbursed them for their labor about 50 cents an hour. In Johnson City, Tennessee, Jessica Compton, who is the mother of Rachel and Blythe, 2 toddlers, the only cash income coming into her household was from her selling plasma, which she did as often as the law allows in the United States, and that is about 2 times a week. And in fact, Jessica had a little divot in her arm from giving plasma so often, and virtually all of the $2 a day poor we found in communities had this divot because plasma sales are ubiquitous among the $2 a day poor. We went to the numbers to figure out what was happening in the plasma industry, whether there was evidence that plasma sales were growing, and indeed in 2005, there were about 10.2 million plasma donations in the United States. By 2011, so 6 years later, that number had increased to 23 million. So those are just two examples of these really bare bones, sort of scraping the bottom kinds of strategies that literally consume the time and energy of families 24/7 who could be using that mental energy to think about how to get ahead. But instead, they're really trapped in a state where they have to use all of their, their bandwidth to focus on bare bones survival.
You know, the whole idea, going back to you, Mr. Greenstein, when you talked about you need a job to even take advantage of certain benefits. And in the community where I live, not where I am, not just my district, where I live, there are a lot of people who don't have jobs. And, you know, I think some kind of way our society has got to figure out how we put them in a position to even to qualify for a job that will even allow them to take advantage of these types of opportunities, like the tax credit. And it seems to me that, you know, one of the things that we're trying to do in Baltimore is trying to, first of all, attract industry to the city, then trying to make sure that we train people. There are a lot of people that have dropped out. Have you found that, Sister Simone? People who have literally, I mean, they're like dropped out of everything almost, particularly the ability to get a job, even if a job was available.
Absolutely, and what we found on the bus, especially when we have in Topeka, we visited the homeless shelter there, and I talked to two different families where the parents had lost their jobs in the recession, had very minimal part-time jobs. This issue of part-time, irregular hours, on-call, unpredictable hours, it just became too much for them. Too much. And so what these two families had done was, first they lived in their cars. They kept their cars together. They knew each other from the same neighborhood. They kept their cars together, and then finally they decided they just couldn't do it anymore for the kids. One had two small children. The other had a second grader and a toddler. And it was just too hard on the kids, so they went to the shelter. The shelter, the rescue mission in Topeka, Kansas, had to rent a warehouse, so not to house goods, but to house people, because they had had an overflow of people who had, in the economy, especially in Kansas, where they had had low unemployment, have higher unemployment, folks are discouraged, they have no hope, and it was too big of a struggle to try to hold things together. It's better to live at the rescue mission for a period of time that they can and try to regroup. But I don't know what they're going to be able to do to regroup. Time alone is not sufficient.
You know, Senator Warren talked a bit about our Republican colleagues, and I just, you know, I asked those three questions to lead to this, to ask for your help on this. I believe deep in my heart that people do things for one of two reasons, or both, either to avoid pain or to gain pleasure. And it seems to me we've got to try to figure out, how do we convince our colleagues, I mean, that it is better for all of us if all of us are rising, as opposed to some of us falling through the cracks and others at the very top rising. And the pain that would come when we fail to lift up those children that I talked about a little bit earlier, and that you've been talking about. How do you all are into this. This is what you do. I mean, and this is, you preach it, you research it, you deal with it, you sleep it, you eat it. So the question is, what advice do you have for us? And so how do we get those messages through?
Well, I published 2 books this year.
Just saying, huh?
Just saying, with co-authors. But the other is on the EITC. It's an in-depth ethnographic examination of families on the EITC. In fact, one of my co-authors is is a student of Senator Warren's, and this program is remarkable. And it does precisely what you're talking about. And it knits hard-pressed citizens back into the families, into the fabric of society. When people go to H&R Block and claim their tax credit, it's like a badge of citizenship. The way folks talk in our study about what it feels like to claim the EITC rather than TANF, they use language like, I feel like a real American, right? And the surplus, the momentary surplus that the EITC gives them, that lump sum, gives them the mental bandwidth to get up out of that mental tunnel they're in of survival and to think ahead and to make long-range decisions. So we see what we do here is we track every dollar that they spend over the next 6 months of that EITC. What we find is that 40% is reserved for mobility purposes, 25% is used to pay off debt, and another 17% of that 40% is actually saved. Now, this is remarkable for a group of people who are really, really poor, right? They're in the red in a typical month without the EITC. So what we argue is that this program, maybe inadvertently, is really telling us something about what we should be thinking about in social policy more generally. Can we think of more ways to bring dignity to the poor through our social welfare programs so that we can knit them into society and make citizens rather than making non-citizens, which of course is what many of our safety net programs have done for decades.
Now, I know I'm going right to you, Mr. Greenstein, but I got to get this point with Dr. Eden. You said something that was so powerful. Yeah, I'm talking to you, Dr. Eden. And I'm coming right back to you, Mr. Greenstein. The idea that they save 40% of their benefits on the EITC for transportation. Is that what you said? For mobility. When you say mobility, what is?
What I'm
remember
saying
you?
is that so that was a little bit of code. Sorry about that. But
Okay.
40% for things that they think will get them ahead. So they save.
I got you.
They save for college.
That says a lot.
They purchase durable goods. They get used cars. So they're not just sort of getting by. They're deploying this money to get ahead.
And reaching for hope.
They're reaching for hope.
Dr. Greenstein.
So it doesn't happen too often these days, but every once in a while there's a policy area that comes along where bipartisan progress can develop. The most striking example now, more at the state than the federal level perhaps, is the sudden bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform and reducing incarceration. So, not to put this in quite the same category, but something that I think over several years has potential is the idea of federal funding to states for subsidized jobs programs, almost. I wouldn't use the term jobs of last resort. I don't think politically that works, but to some degree, it's what it is. That would help people who can't otherwise find jobs. And actually, I think it relates to criminal justice reform because unless one has ban the box and all of that, a lot of these people, employers won't take them, at least until they get some work experience post-involvement with the criminal justice system. Here's what's really interesting. The 2009 Recovery Act had an item in it, $5 billion, called the TANF Emergency Fund, and states were allowed to use these funds for any of three purposes, and one of them was this new idea of creating a subsidized jobs program. The subsidized jobs could be public, nonprofit, or private. The majority of them in most states were actually private sector. Over 30 states seized upon that, red states equally with blue. Within 15 months, they had created 260,000 job slots for low-income parents and youth. Among the most enthusiastic advocates were Republican governors like Haley Barbour of Mississippi. It was such a big success that, given that the Recovery Act had created it through September 10, remember when so many people made the mistake of thinking this was a short temporary down. It might be deep, but it would be temporary. It would be gone in a year and a half. we can't have stimulus last too long, blah, blah, blah. So in the original bill, this funding was only for use through September 2010. When the downturn continued and this program was a huge success, the Obama administration went to the Hill in the spring of 2010 and said, we need to extend it beyond September 2010, with huge support from a number of Republican governors. They failed to get it extended. We talked to a number of Republicans on the Hill about that, and the response we got was, Bob, I know it's a good program. Don't you understand? This is part of Barack Obama's Recovery Act. We Republicans can't extend anything that was in Barack Obama's Recovery Act. When I talk to conservative analysts who work on poverty and jobs now, they're interested in this. We probably need to wait till Barack Obama is no longer president. We shouldn't talk about it in connection with the Recovery Act. It should no longer be connected to the TANF program, which is controversial. But the concept of subsidized jobs is something we might have an opportunity to do something with. Having said that, I think all the things we're talking about, important as they are not as important as if we could get the economy back to the kind of tight labor market we had in the late 90s, with a 4% unemployment rate when people who otherwise don't get jobs got hired, and real wages rose at the bottom of the wage scale. So when I think about what could we do on poverty, the question arises in my mind, and this is certainly something Senator Warren knows more about than I do. Can we rethink the 2% inflation standard? Will the economy fall apart if it's a little higher? I think we're a little off on the employment-inflation trade-off. There's an important paper by one of Kathy's colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Lawrence Ball, an economist there. He suggests you could experiment with moving the inflation standard up towards 4, and he didn't think there'd be terrible effects. But all of our progress on poverty will be limited until we can get back to and stay longer at very tight labor markets that have more jobs and more pressure for employers to raise real wages at the bottom of the wage scale.
Senator Warren?
You know, you're right about this, but the problem we've got is we're not tightening the labor market. And I think part of this goes to what you talk about in your book, Dr. Eden. I want to go back. I want to talk a little bit more about jobs. These are things I just want to make sure we get on a public record. I know some of them you've said before, but I want to make sure we get them in here. Decades before the Welfare Reform Act of 1996, critics of welfare and critics of cash assistance began talking about cash assistance increases the number of unwed mothers. There was never any real proof for this, but Ronald Reagan took this story out on the stump in 1976. He talked about the welfare queen, someone who collected welfare checks from the government and lived a very comfortable life and had absolutely no interest in working. And that kind of story has been repeated over and over again. So I'm curious about what the data tell us about what's actually happening to poor families in America. So in your book, Dr. Eden, you talk about families living on $2 a day, 1.5 million families, 3 million children, living on virtually no income in any given month. Based on your research, do you think that these people live in extreme poverty because they don't want to work?
You know, I was stunned. I was stunned. We were at dinner at Rosa DeLaro's home, and we were discussing that some folks hold the view that the number of zero income SNAP households has risen dramatically in the United States from around 400,000 15 years ago to 1.3 million currently. And the view was expressed not by anybody at the dinner, but the view, they had heard the view that this was proof that SNAP was working against welfare reform, and people were so comfortable on SNAP they didn't want to work. I was absolutely stunned by this line of reasoning. But there is virtually no one we could find. I've been at this business a long time. You know, I've been researching poor families since the early '90s and wrote my first book on welfare prior to welfare reform. The desire to work, the salience of the work identity is astonishing. It's really astonishing. And back in the day when I was studying welfare prior to reform, many single mothers really said, gee, you know, maybe I should stay home with my kids, and really saw parenting and working as contradictory goals in some way. That's not true anymore, for better or worse. I mean, you know, we know a lot of moms who work 2 and 3 jobs in the EITC book, and this is frankly scary because their children are raising themselves. So that's not what they want. You know, as Sister Simone said, parents need to spend time with their kids. But these are workers, and we even see it in the numbers. You know, 70% of these children have a parent working. 10% are claiming anything from TANF, often sometimes because they don't know it exists, but sometimes because they refuse to be branded a dependent when they'd rather be a worker. So, you know, this notion that we have this group of hammock poor or this dependent poor that you could separate from the working poor, I don't think we have evidence that those two groups are distinctive anymore.
Sister Simone, you have met with families all across this country in your Nuns on the Bus tours and otherwise. You're an expert. So tell us, you talk to poor people every day. Are they poor because they don't want to work?
I have never met a person living on the margins who says, oh, it's easy here, that's why I'm doing this, I don't want to work. What I have always met are people who are trying to figure out how to survive. Let me give you a couple of examples. In Milwaukee, I met Billy and his wife, and they had their hours reduced in the recession, but they were still working. So they were working probably about 60%. So they lived in their car for a little while. They had 2 boys. That wasn't working for the boys because of toxic stress, I think, because the boys were acting out in school because they kept them in the same school that they had been in, but they were living in the car. And that was terrifying. So they put their salaries together. They get an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment. They were lucky to do that in Milwaukee. And they used food stamps during the day to feed the boys. The parents ate 1 meal a day by going to the St. Benedict the Moor dining room where they gave free food. And Billy said to me, you know, it's not the best place for my kids. I really wish we could just eat at home, but I know, he has a 14-year-old, I know my 14-year-old is gonna get enough food here, and he's rarely filled up. And you could see the 14-year-old eyeing the roll on his dad's plate and grabbed it when his dad said it was okay. But I think that the piece for Billy and his wife they were trying to work. They were holding on to minimal jobs that weren't enough, but he was afraid he would lose even that. And it's the fear of the loss of work, which is what would that say then to his kids? That's who people are.
Yeah, so I feel like when I ask these questions, it's just to give you an opportunity to be able to bear witness to what's happening out there. Let me ask you one more related to this as we talk about work. The minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. How can so many working people, you said 70%, right, of those living on $2 a day, have a working parent at some point in this month? How can there be so many working people living on $2 a day with a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour? Dr. Eden or anyone else can jump in. What's going on in the labor market? I just make sure we get this
I can give
on the
an answer,
record.
and then the gentleman to my right, who knows a lot more than I do, can give a better answer. We saw 4 things come up again and again. First of all, and we don't talk about this enough, it is literally impossible in many labor markets to find a full-time job. Yes. We've got to rethink the way we disincentivize employers in this regard. But in the city of Baltimore, where I'm proud to say that I've made my new home, it is you can get 15 hours a week at Safeway. But your hours are going to be so unstable, it's very difficult to get a second job. If you get a second job and you can't fulfill your obligations at Safeway, Safeway will penalize you and cut you to 5 hours a week. So insufficient hours is probably the most important part of this of this equation. Then you've got, of course, wage theft, you've got labor law violations, you've got unstable hours. So 7.25 an hour, yes, that's low, but what ends up happening, right, is people's lives crumble. And then it's hard to hang on to those jobs. So when you have wages that are so low and so unstable, so unpredictable, those wages interact with affordable housing and other fragility in families' circumstances. And these families end up one emergency away from destitution. Ray McCormick in Cleveland, Ohio, you know, she's the 2-time cashier of the month at Walmart because she memorized the barcodes of all the produce items by reading them into her recording device on her phone and putting it on a continuous replay as she slept at night. Her truck runs out of gas because she shares the truck with several housemates, and she's summarily dismissed because she can't get to work on time. So, of course, this ends up, you know, spiraling into a long and pervasive spell of extreme poverty that she's actually still in. I think we're going on about now 3.5 years in this particular spell for a woman who's been in extreme poverty since she was about 12 years old, and in fact, you know, she's only 24, but she looks like she's 40.
Yeah. Did you
Yeah,
want to
I
add?
don't have a lot to add. I think, as Kathy just said, for the people who are living on less than $2 a person a day, it's not so much the $7.25 an hour level of the minimum wage, certainly too low, but their problems are even beyond that, and they're more related. The example you just gave is the perfect example. They're more related to the lack of protection these people have as workers in the labor market. The example, it's the perfect example, the woman who got awards for being a good employee, and the boyfriend or brother, I forget who it was, uncle used up all the gas and she couldn't get to work the next day and her job was gone. Another one of your stories that sticks in my head was the woman who worked in a job, I think cleaning industrial places or something where there were
Foreclosed homes in the south side of Chicago.
hazardous chemicals, all sorts of things, and she kept getting sicker and sicker and sicker, but kept working and working, and finally got so sick she couldn't work, and I think she got canned.
Yes.
And it's those kinds of things that for me stood out in the book, that there's one narrative. These people don't want to work. That's why they're at the bottom. And I thought the single thing I learned most from the book was how vividly it showed that these people were killing themselves trying to work. But that they were so vulnerable in the labor market that the intersection of their personal problems, which they have,
Yeah.
and their lack of their vulnerability related to employers, made their job so unstable, and it was when they would lose the job, generally, that they would fall into the $2 a day poverty.
Can I add
Please,
one
Sister
piece there?
Simone.
Because this is just so important, that one of the challenges is that our focus has been on those struggling at the margins, as it should be. But the piece that we realized at Network is that it's a complex web of relationships in our total society. And so we've been doing business roundtables around the country this year to try to get business talking about the shared responsibility, not just for jobs, but for responsible employment practices. In Chicago, Arise, the low employment center there, helped a woman, I met Martina, who had worked for 13 years at a car wash as an immigrant. Her employer told her that she could only work for tips, and labor laws did not apply to her. So for 13 years, she worked at the car wash for tips only. And apparently, this is a fairly prevalent practice in the Chicago car wash industry. And so now they're beginning to organize against it because of statute of limitations and a variety of other things. They could only get 4 years of back pay for her. But I believe we have so focused on the alleged laziness of some people, that we have not looked at what you started with, which is that if you work hard, play by the rules, then you can achieve. The fact is, in our country at this point, it's not possible. And then we hear from our business roundtables, what a challenge it is, because they have such a tight, many of the employers feel that they have tight markets where costs are so constrained, and the bottom line, cheapest possible thing is required in a consumer society, that they feel they don't have the luxury of, quote, carrying these folks that can't show up. And so you have the employer feeling constrained, a little guilty for firing somebody, but feeling like he or she doesn't have a choice. And then you get us, the consumer, insisting on the lowest possible price. We have got to make this story about all of us. It's the 100% that need to address this. We need to pay just prices, we need to pay just wages, and employers need just business practices, and we need folks having a chance to step up. It's all integrated, and we can't just focus on one little piece of this, because we won't solve the problem if we only focus on them.
Thank you. You know, it's just so important to make the point. Poverty is not the result of character flaws.
Amen.
We have a whole broken employment market. We have a broken market for people who are born into poverty. It's just not working, and we have got to do better on that. So thank you. Congressman.
One thing that you all didn't say, and I haven't even read the book.
You've got to read the book.
I will read the book now.
You can't be in the club if you don't read the book, yeah.
Is that there are so many people competing for those jobs, too. See, they have so many people, right, they got so many people competing for the jobs, it's no big deal. They can fire somebody, but there are about 10 or 15 that are be glad to breathe the chemicals. I mean, and not, you know what I mean, they'd be glad to take the job because they need the money, am I right? Yeah. Let me, I want to go back to something that Mr. Greenstein said, but I really want to direct my first question to you, Dr. Eden. You know, in your $2 a day book, which I'm going to read, I want you to talk about how states fail to effectively administer block grant programs, fail to alert qualified individuals about the availability of the programs, and then even actively discourage qualified families from applying. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so.
Because I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. You go ahead.
Yeah, so, you know, TANF is way, way, way undersubscribed. So TANF used to touch the lives of about 7 in 10 poor families prior to welfare reform. Actually, in 1979, it was 80. It was more than 8 in 10. We're now down to just over 2 in 10. And in many states, it's less than 1 in 10. 12 states, less than 1 in 10, based on CBPP figures. So what's really happening out in the field? First of all, there's an information problem. TANF has become so atrophied that people don't know it's around. So Travis Compton in Johnson City, Tennessee, when I asked him why he wasn't on TANF, he and Jessica, you know, these desperate family giving plasma, he said, "What's that?" Madonna Harris in Chicago, desperately poor, she and her daughter were moving across a string of homeless shelters in Chicago over the summer of 2010 when I first met her. She looked at me and she said, "Haven't you heard they're not giving it out anymore?" Finally, Ray McCormick actually goes to a TANF office at the urging of friends after spending roughly 12 years in $2 a day poverty. And she's told, "Honey, I'm sorry, there are so many poor people, we don't have enough to go around, come back next year." Now, I don't think it was true that Ohio had run out of TANF. According to my research, they were sitting on about a $1 million surplus at the time. So that's probably not literally the case, but she was offered no sort of help or recompense. She wasn't told how to get on the LIHEAP program. She wasn't told where the nearest food pantry was. She wasn't told how to get a housing subsidy. She was just turned away. Now, how do block grants interact with that? States are actually hassled if they try to serve their poor through TANF. It's easier to shed people off the rolls, and if you do that, you get to use the money for other purposes, and states have done this. Only 25% of the $16.5 billion that the feds send to the states is now going into the pockets of poor people. You know, less than 5 million people are getting any cash from TANF right now. less than $5 billion is going into people's pockets from the TANF program anymore. Instead, in some cases, it's being spent to fill state budget holes, pay for child welfare, things that states would ordinarily have to pay for out of their own pockets. And in those cases, TANF has become welfare for the states, not for people.
But Dr. Greenstein, you were talking about the Ryan proposal that he talked about today. What are the potential consequences of converting programs like SNAP into block grants? And you know, I think the thing that bothers me probably more than anything else is this whole idea of these governors and state legislatures which have failed to provide health care under the Affordable Care Act with regard to Medicaid. To me, it is criminal, because that means people who could still be alive are dying. I mean, and when the money is there so that they can get health care. And I've heard all of the excuses and everything, but anyway, that's just my little commentary. But you tell me what your concerns are.
Yeah, I agree with that commentary. So there are at least four interlocking problems of converting something like SNAP into a block grant. Problem number one, the way the program works now, there's a national eligibility and benefit structure. If you become poor and you meet the eligibility criteria, you are eligible to receive benefits. You apply, you get the benefits. The state can't say, I've run out of money. The state can't turn you away. It's an entitlement program. Block grants aren't. Under block grants, states get a fixed amount of money each year. So under SNAP as it works now, when we had the Great Recession in 2009 and thereafter, the SNAP, more people lost their jobs, more people became poor, and SNAP accommodated them. It really did a terrific job in the recession. If you had a block grant, states would get a fixed amount of money in the beginning of the year. You had a recession, need went up. Yeah. It's tough. There's no more money. That's problem number one. Problem number two, related to that, as I noted, people who were eligible don't necessarily get the benefits. Not only could the states change the eligibility criteria, but they could put you on a waiting list and just say, I don't have enough money. That intersects with the third problem, which Kathy mentioned. So the way block grants generally work, like Congressman Ryan, Speaker Ryan's proposal from last year, which he reiterated today, is he would take 11 or 12 programs, take all the money from them. The biggest by far would be SNAP. It would be like the piggy bank. You'd merge it into one stream. You kind of put it on the stump and say, governors can use this for low-income issues. Well, every state has some low-income programs and services it contributes money to. So the state can back out its money and substitute the federal money. Well, the response to that is, no, they couldn't do it. There are maintenance of effort requirements. No one's ever designed a maintenance of effort requirement that is seal-proof. And the GAO studied what happened under TANF, which has a maintenance of effort requirement, and confirmed that states had indeed substituted some of the federal block grant dollars for former state dollars. They take the freed up state dollars and they can use them for anything from plugging budget holes to corporate tax cuts to get corporation to locate in your state rather than in the neighboring state, right? And all of this leads to the final problem, that the money gets spent in such a diffuse way that you don't have a clear indicator of what's the program trying to do, what's the need for the program, how much money do we need, and it feeds into a loss of federal funding over time. Evidence. We just finished a study a few weeks ago. We looked at every major health, human services, social services block grant in the federal budget. There are 13 of them. We tracked them all since their inception. 11 of the 13 have lost funding in inflation-adjusted terms over time, generally by substantial amounts. You take the 13 as a group, including the 2 that didn't lose money. The 13 as a group in 2015 had 27% less federal money than they had in 2000 after adjusting for inflation. The history is pretty inexorable. Block grants get cut over time because they're so diffuse. It's so hard to figure out what they do. It's not as clear as we have hunger, poor children whose families meet certain criteria qualify for food assistance.
And once a Ryan-type proposal happens, it all gets kind of baked in the cake. Am I right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been sort of saying for years, people are tired of hearing me say it. When a program's funding gets cut, a valuable program, it's not a good thing, but you can live to fight another day and try and get the funding level back. When a program's fundamental structure is changed, and it's just thrown as merged with 20 other programs into some block grant money on the stump, you never get it back. It tends to be forever. That's the history.
Could I also add, the moral perspective from my view is that these are uncomfortable truths that that Congress does not like to look at. And those currently in leadership want to hide the truth in a wallpapered over reality, which is that, aggregate the programs, don't talk about them individually, divide the advocates, and then states can spend it as they want. The fact is, it is difficult to look at the painful reality of poverty, of hunger in the richest nation on earth, and we seem to be losing our moral courage to do that. And so I don't need to urge the two of you, but we certainly will stay lifting the message that facing the mirror of who we really are in this country requires our action and protection of programs directed not just for the sake of giving people food, but for our sake of calling us to conversion and change.
Can I make one quick that you might find of interest? In the early decade, the first years of the food stamp program in the 60s, there wasn't a national benefit structure. There was a lot of flexibility among the states. In the late 60s, teams of medical researchers did studies and found, particularly in parts of the Deep South and Appalachia, rates of childhood malnutrition akin to some third world countries. And it was Richard Nixon, Republican president, who said, we have to have a national benefit standard. Prior to the national benefit standards being set under President Nixon, states like South Carolina said that when your income reached 50% of the poverty line, you were too wealthy to need food stamps. And, to me, having started to work on food stamps in 1972, I'm just incredulous that we're talking about potentially going back to the kinds of structures we had then.
I just want to pick up on this, though. The importance of housing support, the importance of SNAP, yes, on these programs, but also the importance of money. I think this is the part that really hit me in $2 a day. Can you just say just a word about, I don't want to lose any of the programs we've got. And I understand exactly the reason you identify for why we defend these programs. But TANF isn't there. The importance of people having cash. Can you just say a word about that? Dr. Eden, do you want to start because it's so clear in your book?
So here's the big problem. People need cash to survive. And if they don't have cash, they're going to trade away the most valuable assets they have in order to get it. Because you've got to buy your kids socks and underwear so they can get to school, and you've got to pay the utility bills. So Jennifer Hernandez in Chicago has to sell part of her SNAP to get basic provisions for her kids so they can go to school, to get a bus pass so she can look for work. And she ends up trading at a little bodega in Little Village for about 60% of the dollar. This guarantees that she's going to run out of food, right? Down in the Mississippi Delta, Alva Mae Hicks and her 10 kids, she's has to sell off $600 worth of her food stamps. Their poverty is so ubiquitous, the going rate is only 50 cents on the dollar in order to keep the lights on in a climate that ranges in the last 6 months.
And what happens to them if they get caught selling off their food stamps?
It's a felony, and in fact, I'm trying to remember the fine. I think it's punishable by something like, the magnitude of the felony is worse than if you molest a child in many cases. It is a very severe penalty. It says it right on the food stamp application. And what's tragic about this is that families themselves feel it's immoral to sell their stamps, but they feel that they have to do so in order to, you know, keep the lights on when the temperature ranges from 9 to 109 degrees in a 6-month period. So not only are you making families deprived, you're making them into felons by forcing them into this terrible choice.
And we have what's developed in the political system, and sadly, I think it reflects some broadly held views in the country. We are willing to give low-income people cash provided that they work and that we provide the cash through the tax system. That's the earned income credit and the child credit we've been talking about. If you don't have earnings, we don't provide much or anything, depending on your circumstances and your state, in the way of cash. There's nothing that has less popular support than quote-unquote cash welfare. If it's provided in an in-kind form, food stamps, there's a lot more support. So either it's limited to people who work and provided through the tax system, or it's constrained, this is only for food, this is only to a rental voucher. But politically, the most unpopular programs have been those that are viewed as providing cash to people who don't have earnings.
Sister Simone?
But the biggest puzzle for me is the fact that opinion shapers and members of Congress don't realize when they use cash. And the fact that they can't, a woman that I met couldn't get gas, could not get gas, had no cash to get gas. Of course, didn't have a credit card. And because she did not get gas, she couldn't get her kids to school, period.
Yeah.
And the fact that that is not basically seen as a necessity for the very first step on a ladder of opportunity, we're leaving people in the ditch and passing them by. It's wrong.
Yeah. If I can, let me ask just one more question since we're coming to the end here, but we've been talking about families with children. I just want to ask you, you mentioned it earlier, Dr. Greenstein, about one other group of low-wage working Americans who are largely excluded from tax credits, and that's childless workers. Often young men and young women, many of them African-American, who haven't yet started families. These workers often aren't eligible for EITC, and when they do get the credit, it's something like $20 for working a full-time job. So can you just say a word about what we could expect if we would increase and expand EITC for this group? Would that be an effective strategy for helping reduce poverty among this group and increasing labor force participation?
Yeah, I think it would be a highly effective strategy. So we have a lot of poverty among this group, and we have some labor force participation issues, some of which are people who aren't employed, some of which are people who are employed but in the informal economy, which doesn't build you a good career record.
Great resume.
Or a great resume, and also when you get older, you don't have a record for Social Security and things of that sort. The EITC is proven to be remarkably effective in bringing more single parents into the labor force, and there's every reason to believe it could have a similar effect if it were robust enough. It's too tiny now. Among the workers not raising minor children. Plus, as I mentioned, some of these are non-custodial fathers who have these big child support obligations that actually, they don't have much money left if it's withheld from the paycheck. That may be a further inducement to not be in the formal economy. It's important to have them in. The earned income credit helps with that. So I think, and some experts in the field, I'm thinking of Carl Scholes at the University of Wisconsin, and others have written that they believe that if we both enlarge this credit and make it available to young workers, which we should do, that this might have an effect actually in reducing involvement with criminal justice system, recidivism, and the like. But I just want to give you a couple of quick figures. So you take a childless adult with wages equal to the poverty line for a family, for a person of one. That's about $12,600. In 2015, their federal tax burden is over $1,000 and their EITC is $172. So they end up
Further
being
behind.
made, you know, worse off. Or you take someone working full-time at the minimum wage, earning $14,500 a year, their federal income and payroll tax burden, and this isn't counting the employer share, just the employee share. Many economists would say count both. I'm only counting the employee share. They pay $1,500 in federal income and payroll tax. Their EITC is 23. So these are people we're literally taxing into or deeper into poverty.
Can I add something really briefly on this point? This has spillover effects to the family. You know, I've spent, a couple of years ago, I published 2 books on why single mothers, why low-income women don't get married, and another book about non-custodial parents. And, you know, most of these young people start out in hopeful relationships. The dad shows up at the hospital. The 75% of the time, the couple says there's a good or certain chance that they'll marry. And many of them don't end up staying together. And a lot of the explanation for that fragility of the family is that when you're young, you're in the primary family building years, especially young men don't end up finding those stable jobs and sufficient wages in order to sort of make marriage a good bet. So we're not just talking about, you know, the very important point of taxing people into poverty, but we're actually dismantling American families. You know, 42% of all children are born outside of marriage in this country. Cohabitation is very fragile in this country. It's not like Europe. So marriage is sort of a code for couple stability, and a lot of what's going on there, some of it is cultural, but a lot of it is really economic.
Can I add just briefly one other category? And it comes from Laura, who I met in Indianapolis. She's early 50s. She was a stay-at-home mom. She raised her kids. Her husband died unexpectedly. No life insurance, no pension, no nothing. A little bit. Her kids are now adults. She's entering the labor force for the first time at a minimum wage job, which is, as you've pointed out, basically being taxed into poverty. She was about to lose the home that she and her husband had paid on for 29 years because they had a 35-year mortgage, and she had almost paid it off, but she wasn't going to be able to do it because of the very low income that she has. She's desperate. She's desperate.
Thank you. Please, no, go ahead.
I want to just wrap up by thanking all of you for being here today. This has been extremely helpful. You know, we are talking about the EITC and then the CTC, and I often say that one of the things that we have to do in our society, and I tell my constituents this, is that number one, we must protect our progress. See, a lot of times we want to move forward, but we got to protect what we already have. We find in the Congress that proposals like the Ryan proposal are presented, and a lot of people say, "Oh no, that'll never happen." I mean, but we have seen over and over again where these types of proposals are put forth, and there are folks who buy into them. And the next thing you know, things are changed, and then you create a new normal.
Yep.
And then the old normal, you don't even know anymore. As a matter of fact, you move further and further and further to the right. And even when you compromise, you're still over in right field. And so, you know, we're just going to have to keep working at it. And going back to what I started with, talking about Freddie Gray, you know, I thank you all for just caring about folks who are going through difficult times, and a lot of people who there's a piece in the Negro National Anthem that says, felt in a time when hope unborn had died. hope it was already dead. And so a lot of what you're talking about is giving people some type of sense of hope. And I think when people lose hope, it gets very, very difficult. That's why I went back, talked about that stress. What did you call it? Stress?
Toxic stress.
Yes, toxic stress. Because I think a lot of people have gotten to a point where they are blinded by what they see because they don't see very much. And, you know, with regard to the tax credit, we do have a challenge in trying to get people prepared for work, to get them the jobs. And the one thing, and I was reminded when you were talking, Dr. Eden, we had since you're familiar with Baltimore, you know, I'm on this KIPP school board, and Hopkins, just working with us, have now bought a clinic to be right there on site. I mean, this is a very comprehensive clinic with a pediatrician, and it's one of the very unique situation in our country that you have a full-time clinic doctor there and everything. But anyway, so they were talking about, we were opening the doors, cutting the ribbon, and one of the parents said, "You know why I'm so glad that this clinic is here?" And I said, "Why?" She said, "I cannot afford to miss 1 hour of work. So at least if my child is getting the child care," and they had a situation where the child could actually lay there in the little clinic if they got sick and did not have to go home. And you know, of course, if it was something acute, they'd send them to the hospital. But in other words, if they were having a headache or having some problem, they didn't have to send them home. And she said, "That, you don't know what that means." She said, "I worry so much that my child is going to get sick." And she said, "If I miss a day, I may lose my job." And she said, "But just as significantly, I can't afford to lose the pay." And so apparently her benefits, you know, as far as time off and that kind of thing, could not have been substantial. So I don't think that a lot of people really realize what people go through every day. And then this other piece that I guess that we haven't talked about a lot here is this whole thing of personal responsibility. We have a tendency to blame the victim. You know, they would say, "Oh, it's your fault. You're lazy. You're not this and you're not that." And you all have talked about how the people want to work. They want their dignity. Yeah. And the thing that I find amazing is that so many people, I guess a lot of people, you know, I remember when I read Senator Warren's book, and she was talking about her life as a little girl. I tell you, I couldn't get past the first 10 or 15 pages without dropping a tear. Yeah. Because I knew that out of her pain came her passion to do her purpose. In other words, you know, and some people have never experienced anything to even know how to, I mean, they don't even relate whatsoever. And so therefore, we have to have people like you all doing the research, talking to the folks, understanding it, and then putting it out there in the universe with passion and compassion to help us get this message across. But so again, I want to thank you very much. I've learned a lot sitting here today.
And I want to add my thanks as well. The frustration sometimes of this place, we have something we know works. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credits, they're not enough. We need more. There is so much more that we need to do, but at least we know that this works. And you are here as the negotiations are going on in the halls of Congress over who's going to get the tax breaks over the next 2 years. And Congress is talking about giving literally hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to giant corporations and nothing for our families who are working hard, who are doing their very best, not money into the programs that really prove to make a difference for our families, for our children. So, you know, the way I look at this, you want to say, how can this happen in a country like America? How can this happen in the richest country on earth? And part of the answer is because families don't have lobbyists. They have not hired an army of lobbyists to pound through the halls of Congress to demand that their issues are heard in every room and that their views are in every negotiation. Instead, what they've got is you. So I am grateful that you are here. We are very grateful that you made this forum possible today. We know what we need to do. We know where the fight is. The most immediate fight is on making the CTC and the EITC permanent, expanding it, indexing where needed. But most of all, what we have to do is continue to speak out for those who don't have voices here in Washington. So thank you all, and this forum is closed.